Hi, I'm Peter Rowlett.
And I'm Katie Steckles. And Peter, what's today's mathematical object?
Today's mathematical object is an exciting Enigma machine.
Ooh.
And to tell us about the Enigma machine, I've also brought a special guest, which is Tom.
Hi, hello. I'm Tom Briggs. I'm Learning Manager at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire. For the next little while at least. I'm leaving soon and I'll be heading off and doing my own freelance thing. But for now, I'm talking about the Enigma machine, and a little bit of code breaking and things like that.
Yeah, so this is probably one of the most sort of famous objects in maths. I think people who listen to this podcast have sort of been waiting for us to do this, because it's like a really nice example of a really important historical object in maths. But do you want to tell us a bit about the kind of context of it in history? Or
Sure, yeah. A lot of people know about Enigma machines these days from a movie that came out a few years ago called The Imitation Game. And actually, just a bit of secret information. The one that I've got here, which nobody can see because this is a podcast, is the one that was in The Imitation Game. So this one has been played with by Benedict Cumberbatch.
Oh, wow.
Which is just a bit of name dropping from me. Various other people too, including Dick and Dom, but Benedict Cumberbatch seems to get the best response usually. But it is actually a real one. So I've got a real working Enigma machine here, and if I'll press a couple of keys just to prove it to everybody listening. I don't know how well you can hear that.
That's good. We're getting the really serious clunky typewriter noises.
It's a lovely, proper clunky typewriter noise with this. If you do it in a really quiet room, sort of a really nice ring off to it. But I mean, I'm just getting far too nerdy there. I spend too much time with this thing. I've been around the country into various schools and even Butlins as well, and various places with this Enigma machine. So we've spent a lot of time together, so I feel like I know it quite well. So hopefully I'll be able to take you on a bit of a tour of it quite well throughout this episode. But a bit of background information. Enigma machines are quite famous for being one of the cipher machines, one of the ciphers that was broken at Bletchley Park in World War II by the codebreakers. It was used by Germany and other countries actually in World War II, but most famously by Germany, to encrypt their messages. So they would type messages out on the Enigma machine. Every key they press results in a light bulb lighting up, which indicates a letter. Those letters would be written down and then taken away and transmitted via Morse code over the airwaves. Sneaky people in places called Y stations. They were the listening stations that were connected to Bletchley Park. They would be listening to those messages while they were still encrypted, and then writing them down, sending them to Bletchley Park to be decoded. The other end, where they're supposed to be received, is another Enigma machine. And the Enigma operator there types away on that Enigma machine, and they're typing in the gibberish that they've just received, and the letters that light up give them the original message back. So that's just a very, very brief introduction to the Enigma system. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding Enigma machines, so hopefully I've ironed out some of those first off. Would you like me to take you through setting up an Enigma machine?
Yes,
please.
I mean, that sounds good. I'm sort of intrigued by this because nowadays, I guess, you type something into your phone and it presumably goes through some process of encoding and, data encryption or whatever to transmit it to someone else, and they receive it and it's decoded and they just read it on the screen. But this is literally just one aspect of that process. And
yes.
At every stage, there's kind of people in between. This is just like a really terrible typewriter that you press the keys and different things appear on the paper, but
yes.
There isn't even any paper. It doesn't even write it down. You just have to look at the lights. Like it's
Yes, indeed. I sometimes introduce people to this by saying, "What do you think it is?" And a lot of people say typewriter because it does look a lot like a typewriter. And then I say, right, press a key. What happens? They press a key, see the wrong thing lighting up. Okay, why do you think that's happening? It's broken. That's it does. It's a lot like a useless typewriter. But of course, it has a very good secret use. So one of the things with an Enigma machine is that you can change settings on it, and that's the key thing. If I'm going to say the word key a lot today, and I'm trying not to make it into a pun, but it's kind of unavoidable. But one of the most important things with the Enigma machine is you can change various settings on it. And when you're talking about encryption, one of the things that people look at when they want to see how secure a particular encryption algorithm is how many different ways there are to set that algorithm up, how many different ways to kick it off. And on a very basic level, if you have more ways to set up an algorithm or to start off an algorithm running, you have a more secure cipher. That's very, very simplistic, and it's not the whole story at all, but it's a good place to start, I think. So I think one of the things I'm going to focus on with this machine is the number of ways there are to set up an Enigma machine. So if I take you through that from the point of view of an Enigma operator, so not only are you getting to know the Enigma machine and the numbers behind it, you're also getting a free bit of training if you ever happen to be a cryptographer in World War II. So first thing, early in the morning, some say at midnight, an Enigma operator would have to set the settings for a day. There are three main things that get changed each day. The first thing that gets changed is, I'm going to open up the lid now so that nobody can see what's going on here, but I can turn some bits and you can hear some lovely noises. Okay, so I'm turning rotors in the machine there, and you've got 1, 2, 3 rotors in the machine. Now a rotor is sort of like a squat cylindrical cog type thing with a thumb wheel around the outside. But the key thing, the important thing with a rotor is that it is a collection of wires. So there's 26 wires inside this rotor, and if you imagine this squat cylinder, on the circular faces of the cylinder, you've got 26 contacts on each side. And inside this squat cylinder, you've got a wire connecting one of the contacts on one of the circular faces with another contact on the other circular face. And they don't go straight across, they get jumbled up in some way. But the rotor I've got in my hand here, on the back of it, has got a V, a Roman numeral V for 5. So there are 5 different rotors. And if you have any other rotor 5 from another Enigma set and you open it up, you'll have the same wire organization inside there, the same jumbling of wires. But the 5 different rotors with this machine all have different wiring inside the rotors. So the first thing that you would need to do is pick the right 3 rotors to go in your machine, because there's 3 slots for the rotors and 5 rotors to choose from. So I imagine there'll be a number of listeners already shouting 60 at their, I nearly said at their wireless, you can tell where I work. Let's just go with that. At their wireless, the number 60, yes, there are 60 possible rotor orders, because you've got 5 rotors, 3 to choose from, and the order matters. So if you have rotor 1, 2, and 3, that's different from having rotor 3, 2, and 1. So if you had 60 Enigma machines, you could have an Enigma machine with each one of those possible settings, and one of those would have the correct settings for the day. So there's obviously a lot more that we have to do with the machine to make it into a decent cryptographic device. So on the rotors themselves, now this is really hard to explain without seeing what's going on, but there's a ring of numbers around the outside of the rotor. And that ring of numbers has the numbers 1 to 26 on it, and they're kind of labeling. You could think of them as labeling each of the contacts on the circular faces. And there's a little clip on the rotor, and if you undo that clip, you can turn this ring of numbers to a different position, so that the numbers label different contacts. They're shifted to a different position, and that's the second thing you'd have to set in your Enigma machine. Once you pick the right 3 rotors, you have to set those 3 rings one on each rotor, to the right setting. So any one of those 26 settings. So 3 rotors, 26 possibilities on each. You've got 26 times 26 times 26 ring settings to choose from for that particular set of rotors. So that's 17,576 ring settings. Okay. Now, in terms of trying all those possibilities, before I mentioned the idea of having 60 Enigma machines in a room. It's not outside the bounds of reality, but 17,500 Enigma machines is probably difficult to come by. But there were enough Enigma machines around in World War II. There was something like 90 to 100,000 Enigma machines by the end of the war. So it's not beyond the bounds of possibility to have 17,500 Enigma machines together. But then you've got the problem, actually, that 17,500 ring settings for that one possible rotor order. You've got 60 possible rotor orders, and you've got 17,500 ring settings for each of those 60 possible rotor orders. So actually, 60 times 17,500, what's that? A million and
you're getting into sort of
1,054,000
like infinite monkeys on typewriters kind of territory. I'm just kind of imagining this gigantic warehouse of people all sitting typing in the message, and one of them just goes, "It's this one."
Yes, exactly. That's your code breaking machine. It's a million Enigma machines in a room. Although that isn't the full story. Still, there's a third thing that they have to change every day, and that's there's a plug board down the front, which unfortunately doesn't make any interesting noises. But it's a panel of 26 sockets, and each socket is labelled with a letter from the alphabet, and you've got a bunch of cables with a plug at each end. And these cables, each cable pairs up 2 letters on that plug board. So you can have a maximum of 13 cables in that plug board. You could do what Germany did when they first added the plug boards to the Enigma machine, which was, I think they had 6 cables in the plug board. Later on, they upgraded it to 8 cables and then up to 10 cables. So with 10 cables, I'm only telling you the answer for 10 cables because that's the only one I've memorized. But for 10 cables plugged into a choice of 26 sockets, you've got about 151 trillion different possible configurations for that plug board. Now that blows my mind that there's something that I can, that's small enough, it's in front of me, sort of the face of it is sort of the same size as the side of a shoebox or something. And something that small, there are 151 trillion different ways to play with it.
It almost sort of looks like a children's toy where you've got these sort of cables that you plug into different places. And it's effectively just swapping pairs of letters, isn't it?
Or a telephone exchange.
Yeah, something like that.
Anybody who got my wireless reference earlier will know what a telephone exchange is as well. Everyone's going to think I'm really, really old.
Just professionally, right?
Yeah, it's professionally old. I'm very childish at home to make up for it. So, yes.
So that's sort of welcome to the combinatorial explosion, right?
Yes. And that's that 151 trillion number on the plug board itself. Again, those 1 million Enigma machines that we've got, each of those 1 million and however many Enigma machines have 151 trillion different possible combinations for the plug board. So if we then multiply the number that we've got so far by that 151 trillion, we get out this grand total number, which has been, a lot of people will recognize it actually, because there's been a few YouTube videos on it by other famous Enigma traveling educators such as James Grime.
Of the many examples,
of the many examples. And so that video goes through the calculations that I've just gone through, but in a bit more detail. So you get a final number of about 159 quintillion, which you could say 159 million, but I like quintillion because it's an interesting number and sounds very spacey. But that's what, 10 to the 18, I think. So 159 and 18 zeros after the end of it, which is a ridiculously large number. And I like to think of it as if I wanted to break Enigma by brute force. So I sometimes have to explain that brute force, breaking an Enigma by brute force, does not involve a hammer. It involves just trying everything until you've exhausted all the possibilities, and then one of those would be absolutely correct. If you could try one per second, that would obviously take you 159 quintillion seconds. But I think if I work this out correctly, that's getting on for about 400 times the current age of the universe. So it's not possible to have gone through all the settings on an Enigma machine. And that blows my mind. I mean, this box in front of me, which, typewriter-sized thing, there's enough different ways to set it up that nobody could have experienced them all.
Yeah, it's an incredibly large number. I remember being in a fight with James Grime on stage about biggest numbers, and I was like, the number of ways to scramble up a Rubik's Cube, and he was like, pfft. The number of ways to set up an Enigma machine. I was like, oh, yeah.
So that's definitely, if you just span those dials and stuck some plugs in the plug board, probably no one's ever seen that configuration before, right? Is that sort of...
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that before, but yeah, isn't that weird? It's crazy. But also, that number, 159 quintillion, for the total number of ways to set up an Enigma machine, I kind of disagree with that number a little bit. I think the actual number is bigger. And I'll explain a little bit about why I think that. I mean, for one thing, I think when people explain the Enigma machine, actually, they skip the bit about the rings that I spoke about, and they swap it with another thing that needs to change. So the things that I've spoken about so far, they change every day. And there's a piece of paper that tells the Enigma operator which of those settings to use every single day. But for each message throughout the day, there's another thing you have to change. Here we go. There's these rotors again. Nice. Clicking, clunking. I love the sounds this thing makes. There's each of those rotors, there's a thumb wheel on them that pokes out the top of the machine. And there's a little window next to each one that shows you one of those numbers, one of those 26 numbers. And you have to set, for each message you send throughout the day, you have to pick a set of 3 numbers as your password for that message. The way that an Enigma operator would be told to do this, usually, would be to pick 3 random letters, and then change those letters into numbers. There's a table in the lid of the machine that just reminds you A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and so on. So you pick 3 random letters and then change them into numbers, dial them into the lid of the machine. So you've got another 17,500 possibilities there, because you've got a set of 3 random letters being chosen, so 26 for each. But here's where there's a lovely parallel between code breaking in World War II and code breaking today, which a lot of people would term hacking or that kind of thing. In that they're told to pick 3 random letters, but if you as a person are told to pick 3 random letters, I think you're probably thinking of 3 letters at the moment. Yeah, exactly. They're far from random. And I've done this with a room of various different rooms full of people. Probably about 200 people is the biggest that I've done it with. And I say, right, okay, pick 3 random letters in your head. Don't tell anyone else. It's supposed to be secret. And then give me a quick nod when you've got 3 random letters in your head. Great. Now put your hand up if you picked your own initials, and then you get a forest of arms going up. And it just demonstrates that people are rubbish at random. We're not random creatures. We're very, very bad at being random. We've evolved to be particularly good at spotting and making patterns, even when there aren't any patterns to find, we find them. I mean, seeing all sorts of things in slices of toast, for example, that end of things. But the picking 3 random letters is really, really hard. And the harder you think about it and try to get 3 random letters, the more you're thinking about finding some kind of process or procedure with which to pick those numbers, which means it just gets less and less random the more you think about it. And the code makers, the Enigma operators in World War II, most of them were essentially they were teenagers, 18-year-olds stuck in in the middle of nowhere, far away from home. So, I mean, what do they pick for their 3-letter words? Most of them are inspired by girls' names or swear words. So, if you've got 17,500 different possible Enigma key settings to choose from, but actually you're restricting yourself to those which remind you of girls' names and swear words, you're reducing that set of possibilities down. So the code breakers have an opportunity there to cut their own work down. All they have to do is realize that's what you're doing. And so they did realize that this is what a lot of the operators were doing. They realized some of the operators were not only not picking them at random, but they were using the same settings each day. So that helps you get in. And we see that today when, we all have that friend or family member who occasionally pops up on Facebook and says, "Oh, don't listen to any messages you might got of me. I've been hacked." And in modern day Facebook parlance, "I've been hacked" means I had a rubbish password and someone guessed it. And they're making the same mistake that the Enigma operators made in World War II. So, yeah, we've got to take that into account as well. If you're using Enigma properly and you can find a way to generate those 3 numbers, we've got to multiply that number we had before by another 17,500, because you got the ring settings, which a lot of people don't include because they can get a bit confusing, and you've got the rotor start positions as well. And because they use the same numbers on the rotors, on the rings, it's really easy to conflate the two, but they're actually 2 different levels of setting. So
yeah, it's the difference between which way up the rotor is within the machine and which way up the inside bit of the rotor is relative to the outside bit of the rotor.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got that. You got to think about the rotor core and then the labeling of the rotor core in a way. They're 2 different settings.
I guess there'd be some of those would be equivalent, right? If you rotate the inside one way but then rotate the outside.
Well, that's what I was gonna come on to now, because it's not just the case actually of multiplying these 4 numbers that we've come across so far together, because actually, when you look at the ring settings, the key thing on the ring setting, on the ring of an Enigma rotor, is not where that ring is or the orientation of the ring itself is set or the labeling or anything like that. The real important thing is there's a little notch on the edge of the rotor which actually looks like a chip that's missing. It looks like it's broken. But that is a part of a rotor which tells the rotor next to it in the machine when to flick over to the next position. So on the right hand and middle rotors, that notch tells the rotor to the left of it when to turn. But on the left hand rotor, that notch doesn't do anything because there's no rotor to the left of it to tell to turn. So actually the left-hand rotor doesn't need a notch. It only has a notch because one day it might be the right-hand rotor or a middle rotor. So actually, for the ring settings, it doesn't matter where you set the ring for the left-hand rotor because of what Katie just said. With the labeling of the core, the labeling changes, but you can cancel that out by flicking the rotor setting back a few steps just to cancel it out. And from a code maker's point of view, those 2 different settings, they look like 2 different settings. They would be different settings if you wrote them down. But from a code breaker's point of view, they don't know which one of those 2 settings you've used, and you don't care which one they've used because they want to find one of those 2. It doesn't matter which, because they both have exactly the same effect.
So what Katie said was if you shift one way and one the other, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That's true of the last rotor, but for the others, shifting one and shifting it back with the other setting, but you've still moved the notch round.
Yeah, you still move the notch. So with the middle one and the right-hand one, it wouldn't count for any messages that are shorter than the number of steps you need to go to get to the notch, but that's far too confusing.
Right. Do you want to tell us what happens if you press a key? Because we haven't really talked about that.
Yes, that's a good point. Yes, when you press a key, when you set all these settings up, you leave the main ones for the day, but the wheels, when you set the wheels with those 3 letters that I mentioned earlier, when you press a key, the right-hand wheel steps forwards. and it steps forwards every single time you press a key. So as you press the key, you move a plate underneath the key, and it pushes the wheel round. And then when the key gets to the bottom of the press, a circuit is completed, which makes the light bulb turn up. So the wheel turns just before a letter is encrypted. Every single time. Lift the key back up again, lift your finger off the key, it resets, the mechanism resets, so you press the next key, and that wheel changes again. So it clicks round.
So I guess you've got this incredible number of different combinations, and you're saying this is kind of a measure of how strong a code is, like how many different ways it's possible to set it up. And was this part of the reason why, I understand that Germany was incredibly confident that this system was completely unbreakable?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know. I'm not sure whether Germany did the calculations on this at all. I've spoken to various people, including our historian, had informal conversations about this stuff, and I think there's a certain amount of the structure of the German military system was such that Hitler at the top was essentially almost a god and was infallible. Anything he said was true, and then his subordinates would not contradict that, and then their subordinates would not contradict them. And so if someone in that hierarchy said Enigma is unbreakable, everyone below them would say, yes, Enigma is unbreakable. We don't question that. There was an Admiral Dönitz, I think it was, who I can't remember. Never remember the dates, but I think it was 1941, 42. Who he suspected that naval Enigma was being read, and pushed quite hard for the system to be upgraded, and eventually managed to get that through, so that the Enigma machines that the Navy were using were upgraded to ones with 4 rotors in the machine rather than 3, and then they had a set of 8 rotors that they were chosen from. But the 4th rotor was a slim rotor, and then the extra 3 rotors were slim rotors. So it's not just a case of picking 4 from 8 now. It's a slightly more complicated calculation, but it did make the Enigma machine harder to break, and the codebreakers at Bletchley Park were unable to break naval Enigma for about 11 months after that point. So one fairly simple change to the machine stopped Bletchley Park from being able to get into those codes. And that's the break that came after that required certain information to be discovered, which it was mostly to do with code books, getting code books off a submarine. And that's the famous story of capture a submarine and then you can break Enigma because the submarine had an Enigma machine on it. Actually, this is not the first break of Enigma. This is a break of a new kind of Enigma. And the important bit is the code books, not necessarily the Enigma machine itself. So if you might have heard of John Bon Jovi and his activities in the movie U571, which is, frankly, it's a ridiculous movie, but it's entertaining in its ridiculousness. And if you want to learn about the capture of Enigma off a submarine, you probably want to watch that movie and then take the opposite of everything it says. But I think that's a lot of people's first introduction to the story of Enigma. And actually, Enigma was being broken in some form or another since I think it was about 1926. They first started getting a really good idea of how it worked.
Yeah, was it a Polish team that made some of the early breakthroughs?
Yeah, in the 30s, you had a team of 3 Polish mathematicians that did some initial fantastic work on breaking Enigma, and Bletchley Park, through Alan Turing to a large extent, is famous for the bomb machines, which were mechanical checking machines designed to go through lots of Enigma settings very quickly. But even those have their origin with those 3 Polish codebreakers, because the 3 Polish codebreakers, they worked to understand Enigma, and then they worked on developing these mechanical means to find the settings a little bit quicker than they could do manually. So you've got the early machine is a cyclometer, and then they made a slightly more involved machine called the bomber. And the bomber, very similar name to the bomb. I think Alan Turing has probably named it in tribute to the work by these Polish codebreakers. So, yeah, I mean, the story of breaking Enigma starts long before Bletchley Park opens for codebreaking business.
This is the problem when people say, it was invented by the Germans in World War II or whatever. It's just not. It's just nonsense, right? But it's sort of, that is interesting what you said there, because you get this story that the Germans thought Enigma was infallible and couldn't be broken, and that's why they were so lax with it, and blah blah blah. But then I'm aware that there were new versions of it that were stronger that came out during the, and also that the high level communications they had Lorenz for.
Yes,
so they sort of can't have trusted it as much as people make.
A lot of people conflate Enigma and Lorenz, and then you get that chatting about Colossus, and people talk about Colossus as being the machine that broke Enigma, and it gets very confusing from there. But yeah, there were other ciphers being used, and the Lorenz cipher was used at much higher levels. But of course, that was broken as well, arguably not as successfully. But then that's because when you're breaking this kind of cipher, you need your enemy to be making certain mistakes. And they were making these mistakes left, right, and center with Enigma, but they weren't making them quite so often with Lorenz, because it requires a more specific mistake. But then breaking Lorenz, the processes that led to breaking Lorenz were actually based on earlier code-breaking methods for breaking one-time pads, which are themselves unbreakable, but only if you don't use them properly. So if you turn them into two-time pads, they become breakable. So the breaking, there's parallels throughout history with sort of breaking certain types of code and cipher and using code-breaking techniques from decades, maybe centuries earlier, and upgrading them a bit to make them work with these new types of cipher. And it gets really involved and detailed, but it's really interesting to see the little links between everything. What you said about what's actually quite well known about Germany being really confident about the security of Enigma is a very interesting one, and something that is worth looking into is actually what was happening the other way round in terms of British ciphers and what Germany were doing to break British ciphers, because they were having, certainly in the early days, they were having an enormous amount of success against British naval ciphers, because the British Navy were using really quite outdated ciphers and were overly confident in them. So you have the same thing happening both ways. And I wonder if, to some extent, the German Navy's development of Enigma throughout World War II and making it into something that was particularly tough for the codebreakers to get into, they might have learnt something from their own breaking of British naval ciphers.
Yeah, I really love the idea that, they're sort of like, should we use the system? How secure is it? And someone explains how it all works, and they go, wow, that sounds really complicated. I agree. This sounds great. Yeah. I mean, I genuinely, looking at this, I understand intellectually how the whole thing fits together. I cannot even conceive of how you would start to break this. But I guess, a lot of it is based on that sort of somebody makes a mistake or sends us something twice or uses the same settings, and that gives you that little kind of glimmer of interest. But people worked out what the inside of the machine looked like without ever having seen one, which is incredible.
Well, that's certainly true of Lorenz. The Enigma machine, that was known fairly early on what it looked like on the inside. It was, the British government got hold of their first one in 1926, and they bought it off the company that was selling them commercially. So took it apart and worked out how it worked, and then actually commissioned someone to build a cipher machine that was very, very heavily related, very closely related to the Enigma machine, and they called it Type X. So there was a British cipher machine called Type X, which works almost exactly like an Enigma machine, but with extras. So they'd fixed some of the bits that they'd identified as being slightly weak, but it is essentially a rip-off of the Enigma machine.
That's amazing that you could just buy an Enigma machine back in those days. Like, I guess if they're made by a company, I guess you could, but you know,
there was a company called Ericsson. I think it was Ericsson's Swedish company. I think, I don't know if it's any relationship to the more modern Ericsson, but they were making cipher machines throughout the war, and they were selling versions of them to both sides, and underneath the bonnet it was the same thing. It was just slightly different cover. But of course, you know, if you're using it properly, it doesn't matter, because the important thing is not the algorithm. Like, looking at more modern algorithms that are based on RSA, it's easy to find out how RSA works. And actually, how RSA works is not particularly complicated. If you want to work it through with some really small prime numbers, you can do it by hand if you pick the right ones. But if you use it properly, it doesn't matter that people know how that algorithm works. It's the key that counts.
Cool. So thank you, Tom. That's really interesting. So where can people find you if they want to look you up online?
Thanks for having me. It's been really good chatting to you. So if people really want to find me online, I'm looking at building up my freelance portfolio at the moment. I've done a few bits and bobs, and I'm offering my services for maths teaching, online and offline, and doing all sorts of other things, including maths in museums. And you can find out information about what I've done and what I want to do, and how to get in contact if you want to chat about anything to do with that, at tkbriggs.co.uk. And I can also be found regularly on Twitter with the handle at TKB, which is TEA like the drink, KAY like something else, and a B at the end. And I never really know how to say that so that people know how to spell it. But yes, at TKB on Twitter.
Cool. Well, we're also on Twitter. I'm at Stex.
And I'm at Peter Olet, and the podcast itself is at Maths Objects.
And both Peter and I blog at aperiodical.com, which is where you can find more episodes of this podcast.
And if you want to get in touch, if you're a travelling mathematician carting an Enigma machine around the country and want to complain about something, you can email us at objects@aperiodical.com.
The music is Funk Game Loop by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons.
Are we okay? My connection's just gone a bit funny.
Yeah, we lost you a little bit, or I lost you a little bit, but your phone will have recorded it fine. So please don't kill the recording. That's all.
It might well be the internet here, because the internet is from 1942. So